For months, the corridors of Brussels echoed with heated debates over one contentious question: should the European Union impose steep tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles flooding into European markets? The issue split the bloc down the middle. On one side stood nations advocating for protectionist measures, arguing that European automakers needed shielding from what they perceived as unfair competition. On the other, cautious voices warned that antagonizing Beijing could trigger devastating counter-sanctions that would harm European industries far beyond the automotive sector. By August of this year, the protectionist camp had won. The European Union officially moved forward with additional tariffs targeting Chinese new energy vehicles sold across member states. To many observers, this appeared to be Europe taking a firm stance, joining the United States in pushing back against China's growing industrial dominance. The decision seemed clear. Europe would defend its economic interests, even at the risk of angering one of its largest trading partners. But what happened next caught nearly everyone off guard. Rather than weakening China's position, the EU's tariff offensive inadvertently created a golden opportunity for an unlikely beneficiary: Russia. While European pork producers, dairy farmers, and other exporters watched their access to the lucrative Chinese market evaporate, Russian companies stepped in to fill the void, signing lucrative contracts and establishing new trade relationships that may reshape global commerce for years to come. This is the story of how a trade dispute over electric cars spiraled into a complex geopolitical chess match, leaving Europe potentially worse off than when it started. It's a tale that raises fundamental questions about the wisdom of trade wars in our interconnected global economy and whether the European Union miscalculated the true costs of its confrontation with Beijing. If you appreciate in-depth analysis of global economics and geopolitics, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel so you never miss our future investigations into the forces shaping our world. Now, let's explore exactly how Europe's tariff strategy backfired and why Russia may have emerged as the true winner in this three-way economic showdown. The electric vehicle revolution that Europe missed. To understand how we arrived at this moment, we need to examine the dramatic transformation that has swept through the automotive industry over the past decade. The shift toward electric mobility represents one of the most significant technological disruptions in modern industrial history, comparable to the transition from horse-drawn carriages to internal combustion engines more than a century ago. In this revolution, China has emerged as the undisputed leader, while Europe, despite its environmental ambitions and engineering heritage, has fallen increasingly behind. The gap isn't merely about sales figures. It encompasses critical technologies, manufacturing capabilities, and cost efficiencies that determine competitive advantage in the 21st century automotive landscape. Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers have achieved something remarkable. They've managed to produce vehicles that are not only technologically sophisticated, but also significantly more affordable than their European counterparts. Industry analysts estimate that Chinese-made electric cars typically cost approximately 20% less than equivalent models manufactured within the European Union. This price advantage stems from multiple factors, including economies of scale, integrated supply chains, advanced battery technology developed domestically, and, according to European officials, substantial government subsidies. The performance speaks for itself. Battery technology, the heart of any electric vehicle, has become a Chinese specialty. Companies like KTL and BYD have pushed the boundaries of energy density, charging speed, and manufacturing efficiency, creating products that compete favorably with anything produced in Europe or North America. Meanwhile, European battery production has struggled to achieve comparable scale and cost effectiveness, leaving European automakers dependent on imported components, even for vehicles assembled on the continent. The market penetration figures tell a stark story. By the end of 2023, Chinese electric vehicles had captured approximately 12% of the European Union market, a remarkable achievement for brands that were virtually unknown in Europe just a few years earlier. Industry forecasts suggested this share could surge beyond 18% by 2025 if current trends continued unchecked. For European policymakers, these numbers represented more than mere commercial competition. They signaled a potential existential threat to one of Europe's most important industrial sectors. The automotive industry employs millions of Europeans, represents a significant portion of manufacturing output, and carries immense cultural and economic significance for nations like Germany, France, Italy, and Spain. Europe's strategic anxiety and the push for de-risking. The European response to China's electric vehicle success must be understood within the broader context of shifting geopolitical attitudes toward Beijing. Over the past several years, the European Union has gradually moved away from viewing China purely as an economic opportunity, instead increasingly characterizing it as a systemic rival whose interests often diverge from European values and strategic objectives. This evolving perspective has manifested in a series of policy initiatives grouped under the banner of economic security and supply chain resilience. European officials have begun using the term de-risking to describe their approach, a deliberate choice of words intended to differentiate their strategy from the more confrontational decoupling favored by some American policymakers. In practice, however, de-risking has often meant reducing what Brussels calls strategic dependencies on China, particularly in sectors deemed critical for Europe's economic future and security. The electric vehicle industry, with its connections to battery technology, critical minerals, and the broader green energy transition, falls squarely into this category. France emerged as a particularly vocal advocate for action. French officials argued that allowing Chinese manufacturers to dominate Europe's electric vehicle market would not only devastate European automotive companies, but also compromise Europe's ability to lead the global transition to sustainable transportation, a policy priority enshrined in the European Green Deal and various national climate commitments. The French government's position reflected a broader anxiety that Europe was being left behind in key technologies that would define the 21st century economy. Having missed the smartphone revolution dominated by American and Asian companies, and watching as artificial intelligence development concentrated in the United States and China, European leaders were determined not to cede yet another critical industry. This determination culminated in June of this year, when the European Commission, with French backing, announced plans to impose differentiated tariffs on several major Chinese automotive manufacturers. BYD, one of China's electric vehicle champions, would face a 17.4% additional tariff. Geely, another major player, would be hit with a 20% levy. But the harshest penalty, a crushing 38.1% tariff, was reserved for SAIC Group, one of China's largest automakers and the parent company of the MG brand popular in Europe. Additionally, other Chinese manufacturers that hadn't been individually assessed would face a blanket 21% tariff. The Commission established a procedural timeline. Unless a qualified majority of member states objected within 10 days of a hearing request, the measures would proceed to implementation within 4 months. The message from Brussels was clear. Europe would defend its industrial base, and China would have to compete on what European officials considered a level playing field. The numbers behind the confrontation. To grasp the stakes involved in this dispute, we need to examine the commercial relationship between China and Europe in the automotive sector. The figures reveal just how much money and market access hang in the balance. Across 28 European countries, approximately 1 in 5 newly registered electric vehicles in recent years has been manufactured in China. This proportion includes not only Chinese brands, but also European and American models produced in Chinese factories and then exported to Europe, a testament to China's manufacturing capabilities and cost advantages. In 2023, China's total vehicle exports reached an impressive 4.6 million units, marking the country's emergence as a genuine global automotive power. Of this total, roughly 900,000 were new energy vehicles, a category that includes both battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids. The European market represented the most valuable destination for these exports, with Chinese vehicles shipped to Europe commanding a total value of approximately $11.5 billion, accounting for nearly 57% of China's total automotive export revenue. The growth trajectory had been nothing short of spectacular. Year-on-year export figures showed increases exceeding 100% in some categories, suggesting that Chinese manufacturers had identified Europe as a priority market where they could establish their brands and compete effectively against established players. For Chinese automotive companies, Europe represented not just a lucrative market, but also a stamp of approval. Success in the demanding European market, with its sophisticated consumers, strict safety standards, and established automotive culture, would validate Chinese manufacturers' claims to world-class quality and design. However, the implementation of the new European tariff regime threatened to undermine this entire export strategy. When combined with the existing 10% duty already applied to car imports into the EU, the new tariffs would create a total barrier ranging from 27% to nearly 50% for some manufacturers. These aren't trivial costs that can be easily absorbed. For many Chinese manufacturers, European sales had been profitable precisely because of the price advantage their vehicles enjoyed. Adding 30 to 40% to the final consumer price would eliminate much of this advantage, potentially making Chinese vehicles uncompetitive compared to European alternatives, exactly the outcome Brussels was seeking. From a business perspective, the calculus became brutal. Companies cannot operate indefinitely at narrow margins or losses. If the price increases caused by tariffs significantly reduce demand, Chinese manufacturers would face a difficult choice between withdrawing from the European market, accepting reduced profitability, or establishing manufacturing operations within the EU to avoid the tariffs entirely, a process requiring years and billions in investment. For Beijing, the European tariffs represented more than an economic challenge. They signaled that even Europe, traditionally more accommodating than the United States on trade issues, was now willing to take aggressive action to limit China's economic expansion. This political dimension ensured that China would respond, but the nature and scale of that response remained uncertain. China's government didn't wait long to show that Europe's actions would carry consequences. If Brussels expected Beijing to simply accept the tariffs and adjust its export strategy accordingly, they badly miscalculated. In June 2024, as the European tariff plans were being finalized, China's Ministry of Commerce announced the launch of an anti-dumping investigation targeting pork and pork products imported from European Union member states. The timing was no coincidence, nor was the choice of target. Pork might seem like an unusual weapon in a trade war ostensibly about electric vehicles, but China's selection revealed a sophisticated understanding of European political economics and the pressure points that could fracture EU unity. China stands as the world's largest pork consumer by an enormous margin, with annual consumption exceeding 55 million tons, roughly half of global pork consumption. Despite being a major producer itself, China's enormous population and cultural preference for pork mean that domestic production cannot fully satisfy demand. The resulting import market is massive, lucrative, and heavily dependent on European suppliers. Several EU member states have built substantial agricultural export businesses around Chinese pork demand. Spain leads the pack, having exported approximately 560,000 tons of pork to China in 2023 alone. The Netherlands, France, Germany, and Denmark also send significant quantities of pork products to Chinese markets, where they command premium prices and generate healthy profit margins for European farmers and meat processing companies. For these countries, access to the Chinese market represents tens of thousands of jobs, billions in export revenue, and the economic vitality of rural regions where alternative industries are limited. Spanish pig farmers, Dutch pork processors, and Danish agricultural cooperatives all depend heavily on their ability to serve Chinese consumers. By targeting pork, China achieved multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. First, it struck at the agricultural sector, which maintains significant political influence in many EU member states and has historically been protected by European policymakers through the Common Agricultural Policy and other mechanisms. Second, it created immediate economic pain for countries that had either supported or acquiesced to the electric vehicle tariffs. Third, it demonstrated that China possessed the leverage to retaliate against European interests and was willing to use that leverage. Industry analysts quickly calculated the potential damage. If China followed through with anti-dumping duties on European pork, Spanish exporters alone could face losses approaching $400 million annually. Across the European Union, experts predicted that the bloc's share of the Chinese pork import market could plummet by 30 to 40%. As supply destined for China instead flooded back into European markets, prices would inevitably fall, potentially by 20% or more, squeezing profit margins for producers throughout the continent. For EU member states highly dependent on agricultural exports, particularly Spain, but also Denmark, the Netherlands, and portions of Germany, these weren't abstract economic models. They represented real threats to farmers' livelihoods, food processing jobs, and regional economies that had invested heavily in serving the Chinese market. The threat to pork exports accomplished what months of diplomatic discussion had failed to achieve. It fractured the European consensus on confronting China over electric vehicles. Germany, Europe's largest economy and home to automotive giants like Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, and BMW, emerged as a leading voice of caution. German officials pointed out that their country's automakers had massive investments in Chinese manufacturing and sales operations, making them vulnerable to Chinese retaliation. Moreover, Germany's agricultural sector also faced exposure to potential Chinese counter-sanctions. Denmark, with its substantial pork export industry, voiced strong concerns about the wisdom of provoking Beijing. Italy and Hungary joined the opposition camp, each citing different combinations of economic exposure and strategic considerations. Hungary, in particular, has cultivated close ties with China in recent years, including hosting significant Chinese investments in battery manufacturing and automotive production. Germany's Minister for Economic Affairs took a leading role in attempting to defuse the growing crisis, actively promoting dialogue between Chinese and European officials. The German position was clear. Confrontation served neither side's interests, and a negotiated solution that addressed European concerns about subsidies while preserving market access would be preferable to an escalating trade war. Despite these diplomatic efforts, the negotiations produced only marginal adjustments to the proposed tariff structure. CAIC's penalty was reduced slightly, from 38.1% to 36.3%, still the highest rate imposed on any manufacturer. BYD's tariff was trimmed from 17.4% to 17%, a minimal concession that did little to address the fundamental competitiveness challenge. European Commission officials maintained that their investigation had uncovered clear evidence of improper subsidization by the Chinese government to its domestic automotive industry. From the Commission's perspective, the subsidies distorted fair competition, and significant tariff reductions would be inconsistent with their findings and would fail to address the underlying market distortion. The dispute thus reached an impasse. Under EU decision-making procedures, blocking the tariffs would require at least 15 member states representing a sufficient proportion of the European population to vote against implementation. Despite the concerns raised by Germany and others, the preliminary count showed only 4 countries in clear opposition, far short of the threshold needed to halt the measures. With insufficient opposition to block the tariffs and the European Commission determined to proceed, the course was set. Europe would impose substantial additional duties on Chinese electric vehicles, and China would respond with counter-sanctions on European agricultural exports. What happened next, however, revealed a dimension of the dispute that European planners had apparently failed to anticipate. While European and Chinese officials exchanged accusations and negotiated over tariff percentages, another country was paying very close attention to the unfolding crisis: Russia. For Russia, the timing couldn't have been better. Since its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Russia has faced comprehensive Western sanctions designed to isolate its economy and limit its ability to fund military operations. European countries, formerly Russia's largest trading partners, had slashed imports of Russian energy, imposed financial restrictions, and limited technology transfers. The sanctions had inflicted real economic damage, though perhaps not the catastrophic collapse some Western officials had predicted. Russia's economy had proven more resilient than expected, adapting to the new reality through import substitution, finding new trading partners, and redirecting exports to markets less concerned with Ukraine. Nevertheless, Russia needed opportunities to strengthen trade relationships, diversify its export markets, and demonstrate that Western sanctions could not fully isolate the country. China represented the obvious alternative partner, a massive consumer market with a government willing to maintain economic ties despite Western pressure. The EU-China trade dispute over electric vehicles, and particularly China's retaliatory investigation into European pork imports, presented Russia with a golden opportunity to deepen its economic relationship with Beijing by offering itself as an alternative supplier of products China would no longer purchase from Europe. Russian pork producers moved with remarkable speed. Even as China's anti-dumping investigation into European pork was still underway, Russian companies began negotiating supply contracts with Chinese importers and retailers. Russian agricultural officials issued statements welcoming expanded cooperation with China and expressing readiness to increase pork exports significantly. The enthusiasm was mutual. According to Chinese customs data, by August 2024, China had already signed agreements with 3 Russian pork exporting companies. Deliveries commenced almost immediately, with between 50,000 and 60,000 tons of pork shipped from Russia to China, a substantial volume that represented just the beginning of a potentially much larger trade relationship. Russian industry representatives were explicit about their ambitions. The head of the Russian National Pig Farming Enterprise Union announced that Russian producers aim to capture approximately 10% of China's pork import market within the next 3 to 4 years, a market share worth billions of dollars and representing a major expansion of Russian agricultural exports. For Russia, the strategic value extended beyond immediate commercial gains. Strengthening economic ties with China serves multiple Russian interests. It demonstrates that sanctions cannot completely isolate Russia, it provides hard currency revenue to support government finances, and it deepens the quasi-alliance between Moscow and Beijing that has become increasingly important to both countries' geopolitical strategies. The cruel irony for Europe was impossible to ignore. By attempting to punish China for what it characterized as unfair trade practices in electric vehicles, the EU had triggered a sequence of events that directly benefited Russia. The very country Europe was simultaneously trying to isolate and pressure over its invasion of Ukraine. European pork producers who had spent years building relationships with Chinese distributors, adapting their products to Chinese tastes, and establishing their brands in the Chinese market now faced the prospect of being displaced by Russian competitors. The economic losses would be substantial, but the strategic embarrassment was perhaps even more significant. China's response to European tariffs didn't stop with pork. Beijing demonstrated that it had identified multiple pressure points in the European economy and was prepared to utilize them. On August 20, 2024, just as the final details of the electric vehicle tariff structure were being announced by the European Commission, China's Ministry of Commerce issued its own announcement. An anti-subsidy investigation would be launched into dairy products imported from the European Union. The investigation was prompted by a formal petition from the China Dairy Industry Association, which provided evidence that European dairy exporters benefited from subsidies that distorted competition in the Chinese market. After reviewing the submitted materials, the Ministry of Commerce determined that the evidence warranted a full investigation and officially opened the case on August 21st. For European dairy exporters, particularly those in countries like France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Ireland with substantial dairy industries, this represented another significant threat. China imports enormous quantities of dairy products, including milk powder, cheese, butter, and other processed products. European brands had established strong positions in the Chinese market, where rising incomes and changing dietary preferences had created growing demand for imported dairy. If China's investigation concluded that European dairy products benefited from actionable subsidies, Beijing could impose countervailing duties that would make European dairy products less competitive in the Chinese market, or potentially price them out of the market entirely.